The universe operates on rules. Even chaos has a pattern if you know where to look. Demons bleed. Portals open and close. The dark spaces between dimensions pulse with energy that the untrained eye mistakes for nothing, but Dante had spent his entire life learning to read that nothing. He knew the weight of a demonic signature before it fully manifested. He could taste sulfur in the air 3 seconds before a hellgate cracked open. The son of Sparta didn't stumble into fights. He walked into them with both guns already drawn and a smirk already loaded. But this was different. The rift opened without warning. No demonic energy signature. No sulfur. No pulling sensation that usually preceded a dimensional crossing. One moment Dante was standing in the middle of a half-demolished building in Red Grave, his boot on the neck of a mid-tier demon that had been terrorizing a subway station, ebony pressed casually against its skull. The next moment the floor beneath him simply ceased to exist, replaced by a yawning tear in reality that swallowed him whole before he could fire a single shot. He fell for what felt like 3 seconds and landed on asphalt with enough force to crater it. If you want to see more characters collide with universes they were never meant to enter, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments below. Live long and prosper, or in this case, try to survive. Dante pushed himself upright slowly, not because he needed to, but because he was taking inventory. Ebony and ivory were still holstered. Rebellion was still strapped across his back. His coat, red, battered, beloved, was intact. He rolled his neck until it cracked, looked up at the sky, and immediately noticed 2 things. First, the sky was wrong. Not supernaturally wrong, no inverted colors, no demonic aurora. Just gray. A flat, exhausted gray that sat over the landscape like a burial shroud. Second, the smell. He had spent years in demon-infested territories. He knew the smell of death in its supernatural form, acrid, electric, tinged with brimstone. This was something else entirely. This was organic rot. Human rot. The kind of smell that didn't come from the underworld but from the world itself, decomposing from the inside out. He was standing on a highway outside what had once been a mid-sized American city. Atlanta, based on the distant skyline, or what remained of it. Several of the taller buildings had visible damage. Smoke, old and gray rather than fresh and black, drifted from somewhere to the east. Abandoned vehicles stretched in both directions, some crashed into barriers, some simply stopped in the middle of lanes as if their drivers had just stepped out and never returned. Personal belongings were scattered across the asphalt. Suitcases split open. Children's toys. A single sneaker. Dante walked forward slowly, scanning. The first one came from between 2 abandoned sedans. A man, or something wearing the shape of one. Its jaw hung at an angle that no living jaw should achieve. Its eyes were white and filmed over, the color of old milk. Its skin had taken on the gray-green pallor of something left in standing water. It moved with a lurching, gravitational wrongness, like a puppet operated by someone who had only been told what walking looked like rather than shown. Dante's hand went to ivory on instinct. He paused. His demonic senses. The ones that lit up like a switchboard whenever genuine supernatural energy was present, were completely silent. No demonic resonance. No hellfire signature. No soul energy of any kind, dark or corrupted or otherwise. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a demon. It wasn't even registering as a supernatural entity. It registered as nothing. A body in motion with no animating intelligence behind it. That was, if he was being honest with himself, considerably more unsettling than a demon. He let it get close enough to make its intentions clear, reaching hands. Snapping teeth, the low guttural moan that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than its throat, and then he stepped sideways with the casual economy of someone who had been dodging things that wanted to kill him since adolescence. His elbow caught the side of its skull with a sharp crack. It dropped. It didn't stay down. It clawed back to its feet with a persistence that Dante had to grudgingly respect, even if everything else about it was thoroughly unimpressive. He watched it rise, head tilted, genuinely curious in the way he was rarely curious about opponents. He pulled Rebellion from his back, reversed the grip, and drove the pommel straight down through the top of its skull. This time it stayed down. He straightened up, looked at the body for a long moment, then looked at the highway stretching ahead of him, populated, he now realized, with dozens more of the same lurching shapes moving between the abandoned cars in the middle distance. Okay, Dante said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man recalibrating his entire assessment of a situation. He twirled Rebellion once and resettled it across his shoulder. Different kind of hell. He started walking toward Atlanta, stepping over the fallen body without looking down. Behind him, the dimensional rift had already sealed itself shut. Whatever door had opened to drop him here, it had closed without leaving so much as a seam. He was here. Wherever here was. And judging by the smell, the gray sky, and the army of slow-moving corpses between him and the city skyline, here was not somewhere that was doing particularly well for itself. He'd been in worse situations. Probably. The highway into Atlanta was a graveyard that didn't know it was supposed to stay still. Dante moved through it at a pace that was somewhere between a stroll and a combat advance, unhurried enough to observe, purposeful enough to cover ground. He counted 43 of the lurching dead between his landing point and the first major interchange, which told him this wasn't an isolated incident. This was systemic. Whatever had happened to this world had happened everywhere, all at once, or close enough to all at once that the difference didn't matter. He put 3 of them down with Rebellion's pommel when they wandered too close, conserving ammunition out of habit rather than necessity. He had enough rounds for ebony and ivory to last a small war, and his ability to manufacture more via demonic energy meant he wasn't particularly worried about running dry. But old habits from lean years died hard, and there was something almost insulting about spending real ammunition on these things. They weren't demons. He kept coming back to that. His senses remained categorically silent in their presence, no resonance, no signature, nothing that would have caused even the cheapest DMC sensor array to flicker. They were dead humans in motion, animated by something biological rather than supernatural. Some kind of infection, his mind supplied, working through the evidence methodically. The bite marks he'd noticed on several of the fallen ones. The consistency of the deterioration across all of them regardless of apparent time of death. An infection that animated the dead. A plague, not a portal. Which meant whoever was still alive out here wasn't dealing with a demonic incursion they could fight back with the right weapons and the right knowledge. They were dealing with entropy. With their own biology turned against them. With a disaster that had no face to punch and no weak point to exploit. Dante had faced a lot of things in his career. He'd never faced something that made him feel this particular brand of useless. He filed that feeling under, deal with it later, and kept moving. The outskirts of Atlanta proper were worse than the highway. The dead were denser here, drawn to the city by whatever instinct or biological imperative drove them, sound, maybe, or the ghost of memory, some cellular echo of where they'd once lived and moved and eaten. Several storefronts had been smashed open, the glass long since ground to powder by the shuffling of countless feet. A pharmacy had been stripped to the shelves. A sporting goods store had a dried brown stain across its threshold that Dante didn't look at for long. He was cutting through a side street when he heard it, the distinct, wet crunch of a walker going down, followed immediately by heavy breathing and a muttered curse that was distinctly alive in its intonation. He rounded a dumpster and found a young woman. Mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, a short knife in each hand and 3 walkers between her and the mouth of an alley. She was good. Better than good, actually. Her movements were economical and precise, the kind of efficiency that only came from doing something repeatedly under life or death conditions. She took the first walker's eye socket with a left-hand strike that dropped it cleanly, pivoted away from the second's grasping hands with a half-step that put her outside its reach. The third one she didn't see coming from her left. Dante's hand came up. Ivory barked once, a single shot that punched through the walker's temple and dropped it 2 feet from her shoulder. She spun, both knives up, breathing hard. He was already leaning against the dumpster with his arms folded, Ivory back in its holster. "You're welcome," Dante said. She stared at him. Her eyes went to the red coat, to the sword on his back, to his face. And he could see her running the calculation that every competent survivor ran when they encountered a stranger. Threat assessment. Resources. Intentions. She was fast at it. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was steady. "Points for that." "Dante." "You." "Michonne." She didn't lower the knives. "Also points for that." "Where'd you come from?" "I haven't seen anyone new out here in weeks." "Long story involving a hole in the universe," Dante said. "Short version, I'm lost, I'm not infected, and I'm significantly harder to kill than I look. Which, given how I look, is saying something." He nodded toward the fallen walkers. "You move well." "You with a group?" The calculation ran across her face again. "Why?" "Because a group means people, people means information, and information means I figure out what happened to this world faster than wandering around talking to dead things that don't talk back." He pushed off the dumpster and started walking in the direction she'd come from. "Also, I haven't eaten since whatever dimension I was just in, and I'm hoping someone out here has found a pizza place that's still operational." Michonne watched him for a moment, this absurd, unbothered man in a red coat walking through the apocalypse like he owned it, and then, against every instinct that had kept her alive this long, she followed. She'd seen a lot of things since the world ended. She hadn't seen anything like him. And in a world where new things were almost universally lethal, Dante registered as something she didn't have a category for yet. That, she decided, was reason enough to keep him close and keep watching. The prison appeared on the horizon like a bruise, gray concrete and chain-link fencing rising out of the Georgia landscape with the particular ugliness of something built to contain rather than welcome. But Dante had spent enough time in places that were ugly on the outside and functional on the inside to know that aesthetics were a luxury the apocalypse couldn't afford. The prison was standing. The fences were, mostly, intact. There were people moving on the watchtowers with rifles. Someone had made this work. Michonne had been quiet for most of the walk, which Dante respected. She answered his questions directly and without embellishment. The world had ended approximately 8 months ago by her estimate, reanimation was universal regardless of cause of death, the dead could be put down permanently only by destroying the brain, and nobody knew what had started it. She delivered all of this with the flat efficiency of someone who had already processed their grief and come out the other side into something harder and more durable. He'd told her the broad strokes of where he came from, different dimension, professional demon hunter, arrived accidentally, and she had listened without the skepticism he'd expected. When you'd watched the dead rise and walk, he supposed, the threshold for believing impossible things shifted considerably. The gate challenge came from a lean, dark-haired man on the inner fence, watchful eyes, a python holstered at his hip, the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be very careful about who he let inside. He looked at Michonne first, then at Dante, and the stillness sharpened into something more pointed. "Who's this?" "Rick Grimes said." "Found him outside Atlanta," Michonne said. "He saved my life. His name is Dante." Rick's eyes moved across Dante with the methodical precision of a former law enforcement officer, coat, weapons, posture, expression. Dante let him look. He'd been assessed by worse than sheriffs. "That's a sword," Rick said. "Glad your eyesight's working," Dante said pleasantly. Rick didn't smile. "We have rules here. Weapons get checked at the gate until the group votes on whether you stay." "Hard pass on the weapons check," Dante said, in exactly the same pleasant tone. "But I'll keep them holstered if that helps. I've got no interest in shooting any of your people." I've got significant interest in figuring out where I am and how to get home, and moderate interest in whatever food situation you've got running inside those walls." He tilted his head. "You're running this place. You've got survivors, supplies, and a defensible position. You're also carrying the specific kind of tired that means you haven't slept properly in weeks because you're carrying everyone else's survival on top of your own. I'm not a threat to you. I'm potentially an asset. Your call." The silence stretched for a long moment. Somewhere inside the prison yard, a child laughed, bright and brief and startling in the gray landscape. Rick looked at Michonne. She gave a small nod. "You keep the weapons holstered inside the walls," Rick said. "You pull them, you're gone. We clear." "Crystal," Dante said. The gate opened. The interior of the prison was a more sophisticated operation than the exterior suggested. Garden plots in the yard. Laundry strung between posts. Children running between cell blocks with the determined energy of kids who had adapted to extraordinary circumstances because children were, in Dante's experience, considerably more resilient than adults gave them credit for. He counted roughly 30 survivors at a glance, a mix of ages, backgrounds, skill sets. People who had found each other in the wreckage and decided, collectively, to keep going. He was introduced in rapid succession to more names than he immediately retained. Daryl, who looked at him like a threat and kept looking even after the introduction was done, Glenn, who asked 3 rapid-fire questions about the sword before catching himself, Herschel, who assessed him with the calm eyes of someone who had seen too much to be easily rattled, Carol, whose warmth had a steel core visible to anyone paying attention, and Carl, Rick's son, who stared at Dante's coat with an expression of barely contained fascination. Dante ate what they offered, canned beans and dried venison that tasted like cardboard soaked in smoke, and answered questions. He kept his answers honest and complete. Lying to these people would have been both unnecessary and counterproductive. He told them about Devil May Cry, about Sparta, about the demonic incursions he'd spent his life fighting. He told them about the rift, about landing on the highway, about his initial assessment of the walkers. The group's reaction was telling. Rick listened with the focused attention of someone extracting tactical information. Daryl's skepticism never fully dissolved but sharpened into something more interested. Herschel asked 3 careful questions about dimensional mechanics that suggested a more rigorous mind than his gentle exterior implied. It was Carl who asked the question that cut to the heart of it. "Can you stop the walkers? Like, all of them?" The yard went quiet. Every adult in earshot was suddenly very interested in the answer. Dante looked at the kid, maybe 12, with his father's watchful eyes and the particular gravity of a child who had grown up faster than any child should. He thought about the highway. About 43 walkers between him and the city. About the systemic, biological, unfightable nature of what had eaten this world. "I can cut through as many as you put in front of me," Dante said honestly. "But I can't cure what made them. That's not a demon problem. That's a you problem." He held Carl's gaze. "What I can do is make sure whatever's between you and surviving today doesn't make it past me. That work for you?" Carl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yeah," he said. "That works." The herd arrived on a Tuesday. At least, Herschel thought it was Tuesday. The days had developed a tendency to blur at the edges since the world ended, each one bleeding into the next with the monotonous urgency of pure survival. But he'd been keeping a journal, and the journal said Tuesday, so Tuesday it was. Dante heard them before the watch did. He was sitting on the roof of cell block C sharpening rebellion, a meditative habit, the rhythmic drag of whetstone against steel. When his head came up sharply. Not a sound. Something beneath sound. A vibration in the earth that his demonic senses translated as mass in motion, large and relentless and heading directly toward them. He was off the roof before the first watchman on the tower shouted the alarm. The herd came out of the tree line to the south, Hundreds of them, a slow-moving tide of gray and rot that compressed and channeled as it hit the outer fence line. The chain link bowed inward under the collective weight. Two sections gave way simultaneously on the western perimeter, and the dead began to pour through the gaps with the inexorable patience of floodwater finding cracks. Rick was already shouting orders. Daryl had his crossbow up on the catwalk. Glenn was moving the non-combatants toward the inner cell blocks with practiced urgency. Carol had a rifle and was using it with a calm precision that Dante filed away as quietly impressive. But the numbers were wrong. There were too many, pouring through too many gaps, and Rick's people were good, but they were 30 against hundreds with finite ammunition and finite stamina. Dante could see the math playing out in Rick's face, the grim calculation of a man watching the margins compress toward zero. Dante rolled his neck. Cracked his knuckles. "Hey, Grimes," he called across the yard. Rick looked at him. "You might want to get your people back from the western fence line." Rick's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Dante smiled, the wide, genuine smile that people who knew him recognized as a warning. "Because things are about to get loud." He walked toward the breach. The first wave of walkers pushing through the gap registered his approach and turned toward him with their collective, brainless hunger. Dante pulled Rebellion from his back in a single fluid motion, settled into a stance that was loose and almost casual, and cut through the front rank with a single sweeping arc that dropped 6 of them before the blade completed its arc. He kept moving forward. Into the breach. Into the herd. The survivors on the catwalk and fence line went silent, watching. What happened next was difficult to process through the lens of a world where survival meant careful rationing of effort and ammunition. Dante moved through the herd the way water moves through a cracked dam. Not around it but through it, Rebellion describing arcs that were simultaneously efficient and extravagant, the blade finding skulls and temples and cervical vertebrae with the precision of someone for whom this was not a desperate struggle but a practiced art form. Ebony and ivory came out when the press got thick, firing with both hands in alternating rhythms that cleared space faster than the dead could fill it. He was laughing. Daryl, watching from the catwalk, couldn't decide if that made him feel better or worse. Then the center of the herd, 300 walkers deep, a crushing, moaning mass, folded in around Dante from 3 sides simultaneously, and for a moment he disappeared inside it entirely. The yard went silent except for the sounds of the dead. Rick took a step toward the breach. The light hit first. A crimson pulse of energy detonated outward from the center of the herd like a shockwave, physical and luminous simultaneously, lifting walkers off their feet and hurling them backward in a 15-meter radius. The light was deep red, threaded with darkness, and it came from Dante, from something in Dante that had apparently decided the situation. Warranted escalation. Devil trigger. His silhouette had changed. Taller, marginally. The edges of him were wreathed in that crimson dark energy, his eyes burning white, Rebellion in his hand now trailing light as he moved. His speed had doubled at minimum. He carved through the remaining walkers in the breach with a ferocious efficiency that reduced a 300-strong herd to a field of motionless bodies in under 4 minutes. Then the light faded. The yard was quiet. Dante stood in the center of the carnage, coat splattered, Rebellion resting on his shoulder, looking mildly inconvenienced. He turned back toward the prison and found 30 survivors staring at him from fence lines and catwalks and doorways with an assortment of expressions ranging from awe to terror to the particular blank incomprehension of people whose understanding of what was possible had just been revised without their consent. He walked back through the breach. Stepping over bodies with the casual economy of someone crossing a parking lot, and stopped in front of Rick. Rick looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the field of fallen walkers. Then back at Dante. "What," Rick said carefully, "was that?" "Devil trigger," Dante said. "Demonic power amplification. Burns through energy fast, so I don't lead with it. But when the numbers get stupid," he gestured at the field behind him with Rebellion before sheathing it. "It gets the job done." Another silence. It was Daryl who broke it, dropping down from the catwalk with his crossbow slung over his shoulder, walking up to Dante and looking him over with the appraising squint of a man recalibrating. "Huh," Daryl said. Which was, Dante reflected, probably the most honest response he'd gotten all day. Word travels fast when the world is small. The world had gotten very small. No internet, no radio worth trusting, no infrastructure to carry information across the distances it used to cross in seconds. But survivors talked to survivors, and traders moved between settlements, and scouts ranged out further than was probably wise because information was its own form of currency in the apocalypse. What happened at the prison on Tuesday, or whatever day it actually was, didn't stay at the prison. By Friday, Philip Blake knew about it. The governor, as Woodbury called him, had built something genuinely impressive in the wreckage of the old world. A walled settlement of roughly 70 people, functional utilities, organized food production, a hierarchy that was brutal in its clarity and effective in its results. If you didn't look too closely at what the hierarchy required of people, or what happened in the arena on Saturday nights, or what Philip Blake did with people who disagreed with his leadership in any meaningful way, Woodbury looked almost like civilization. The governor looked closely at everything. His scout, a lean, sunburned man named Martinez who was good at moving quietly and better at reporting accurately, had been ranging south when he'd heard the commotion at the prison. He'd found a vantage point in the tree line and watched. He'd watched the herd. He'd watched Dante move through it. He'd watched the devil trigger detonate like a small red star in the middle of the yard. He'd driven back to Woodbury without stopping. One man, the governor said, standing at his window overlooking Woodbury's Main Street. His tone was the particular flatness of someone processing information that excited them while making sure nothing showed on their face. One man cleared a herd that size. In under 5 minutes, Martinez confirmed. And he changed. Mid-fight. Like something came out of him. Something demonic, said Milton, Woodbury's resident academic, from his position near the door. He'd been taking notes with the focused energy of someone who had waited his entire life for data this interesting. The energy signature Martinez described is consistent with certain pre-collapse fringe research into. I don't need the context, Milton, the governor said quietly. I need the application. Milton stopped talking. The governor turned from the window. His one remaining eye was thoughtful and very still, which was always more dangerous than when he was visibly angry. Visible anger was performance. This stillness was calculation. He's at the prison, the governor said. With Grimes. Yes. And Grimes has him. For now. The governor nodded slowly. The thing about Philip Blake was that he understood people. Understood them with the particular intimacy of someone who had decided early in the apocalypse that understanding people was the most reliable weapon available. Rick Grimes was principled, which made him predictable. Principled people made the same choices repeatedly because their principles didn't flex. You could plan around principles. A man who moved like Dante moved, who carried that kind of power, that wasn't a principled man. That was a force of nature that hadn't yet decided where to point itself. Forces of nature could be aimed. Send a delegation, the governor said. Friendly. Supplies as a gesture. I want to open dialogue with the prison. Martinez looked surprised. You want to negotiate with Grimes? I want to meet the man in the red coat, the governor said. Grimes is incidental. Back at the prison, Dante was having a structural disagreement with Daryl Dixon. It had started over watch rotations. Dante had suggested a wider perimeter sweep that would give earlier warning of incoming herds, and Daryl had pointed out with considerable directness that they didn't have the people to run wider sweeps without compromising the inner watch. Dante had countered that one person running a wider sweep was more efficient than two people running a shorter one, and Daryl had said that one person alone outside the wire was one person who didn't come back, and Dante had said that applied to most people but not specifically to him, and Daryl had told him exactly what he thought about that. It wasn't quite an argument. It was more like two differently shaped objects discovering they occupied the same space. Rick had watched it from across the yard with the expression of a man who had learned that some problems resolved themselves faster without intervention. What shifted things was a walker incursion on the east fence, three that had pushed through a gap in the outer wire while everyone's attention was on the western breach repairs. Daryl moved toward them with his crossbow already up, and Dante fell in beside him without discussion, and they cleared the three in about 12 seconds with the unconscious coordination of people who were, despite their disagreements, good at the same fundamental thing. Daryl looked at him sideways afterward. "You're not wrong about the perimeter," Daryl said. It cost him something to say it. Dante could tell. "You're not wrong about the people problem," Dante said. "Run the wider sweep with me. Two people. You're tracking, he gestured at himself generally, whatever this is. We cover more ground, you don't have to trust me alone outside the wire." Daryl chewed on that for a moment with the expression of a man who fundamentally disliked being reasonable when stubbornness was available as an alternative. "Fine," Daryl said. "Dawn tomorrow. You're late, I leave without you." "I'm never late," Dante said. "I arrive at the exact moment I intend to." Daryl stared at him. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Give it time," Dante said cheerfully. "I've got material." 3 days later, the governor's delegation arrived at the prison gate with a truck full of canned goods and a carefully constructed smile, and the governor himself stepped out of the passenger seat and looked through the fence at the man in the red coat with the particular focused attention of a predator identifying a priority target. Dante looked back at him. Something in his demonic senses, quiet since his arrival, calibrated to supernatural threats that this world didn't carry, flickered. Not a demonic signature. Something else. Something human-shaped and human-sourced that his instincts recognized anyway, because evil didn't require a supernatural origin to register as a threat. He'd met demons with better eyes than Philip Blake. The delegation meeting happened at the gate, which was Rick's call and a good one. He didn't open the fence. He didn't invite the governor inside. He stood on his side of the chain link with Daryl to his left and Michonne to his right and conducted the entire exchange through the barrier with the careful formality of someone who understood that the fence was doing more work than the conversation. The governor presented his supplies with generous language and easy smiles and a practiced warmth that Dante, standing slightly back from the group, watched with the detached interest of someone who had spent years reading things that wore human faces without being entirely human. The governor's I found him twice during the conversation. Just twice, brief, controlled glances that a less observant person would have missed entirely. Each one lasted exactly long enough to confirm a position and gather information without telegraphing interest. Amateur, Dante thought. Then revised it. Not amateur. Disciplined. There was a difference. After the delegation left, supplies unloaded, pleasantries exchanged, nothing committed to on either side, Rick turned to his core group with the expression of a man who had just shaken hands with something he needed to wash off. "He wants something," Rick said. "He wants Dante," Michonne said flatly. She'd encountered the governor before, in circumstances she described to Rick in private and to Dante in brief. Her assessment of Philip Blake was delivered without emotional inflection and was therefore more convincing than if she'd shouted it. Everything else was performance. Dante had his arms folded, looking in the direction the truck had gone. "She's right." He looked at me the way people look at weapons they want to pick up. He glanced at Rick. "I've had that look before. Usually from demons. Occasionally from defense contractors. Same basic energy." Rick studied him. "What do you want to do about it?" "Nothing yet," Dante said. He'll make a move when he decides I'm not coming to him voluntarily. Until then, watching him is more useful than confronting him. He unfolded his arms. Tell me more about Woodbury. Merle Dixon came back from a solo run 2 days later with a dislocated shoulder, 4 cans of peaches, and a grievance he'd been fermenting the entire drive home. Dante had met Merle briefly on arrival and formed an immediate and accurate assessment. Capable, contrarian, deeply committed to the idea that his particular combination of skills and toughness put him at or near the top of any hierarchy he entered. Merle had looked at Dante's coat, his sword, the easy way he moved through the prison yard, and filed him under competition with the reflexive speed of a man who was always running that calculation. The shoulder got set by Herschel with the grimacing efficiency of a man who had done it before. The grievance got aired in the yard approximately 40 minutes later. It started as a comment, something about the supply run routes, about how the eastern roads had gotten more dangerous since the prison had started making noise, about how certain people drawing attention to themselves made everyone else's job harder. It was directed at the yard generally but angled specifically, and Dante, who was cleaning ebony and ivory nearby, let the first 2 pass without response. The third one had his name in it. Your little fireworks show brought every walker in a 10-mile radius toward this fence, Merle said, loud enough to be a public declaration rather than a private observation. Cost me 3 extra hours on that run and nearly my arm. So maybe next time you want to put on a show, you think about who's cleaning up after you. The yard went quiet with the specific quality of quiet that preceded things people would be talking about for a while afterward. Dante set Ivory down carefully. Turned to look at Merle with an expression of mild, genuine interest. You're right, Dante said. Merle blinked. That wasn't the response the architecture of his grievance had been built to receive. The herd draw is a real problem, Dante continued, standing up. Devil Trigger puts out an energy signature that carries. I've been thinking about how to minimize it. He picked Ivory back up and resumed cleaning. If you've got route suggestions based on current herd distribution, I'll take them. You know this terrain better than I do. The silence had shifted quality. Merle stood in the middle of it looking like a man who had loaded a weapon and discovered the target had turned into something that didn't know it was supposed to fall down. That's it? Merle said. No, you're not gonna. What did you want me to do? Dante asked, genuinely curious. You made a fair point. I agreed with it. I asked for your expertise. He tilted his head. What exactly were you hoping for here, Merle? Darryl, from across the yard, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood. Merle's jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, with considerably less volume than he'd started with, East roads are compromised past the ridge. Take the 14 bypass if you're running south. He turned and walked away with the stiff dignity of a man retreating without technically retreating. Rick watched him go, then looked at Dante. That was well handled, Rick said quietly. He's useful, Dante said simply. Useful people who feel disrespected do stupid things. Useful people who feel heard do smart ones. He holstered Ivory. I've managed enough difficult personalities to know the difference between a fight worth having and a fight that just wastes everyone's energy. Rick was quiet for a moment. You've led people before. It wasn't quite a question. Dante looked at the prison yard, the garden plots, the children, the watchful survivors moving with the purposeful economy of people who had decided collectively to endure. He thought about his office in Red Grave. About a lifetime of solo work and the deliberate distances he kept. No, he said. But I've watched enough people lead badly to know what the other thing looks like. They took him on a Wednesday. 4 vehicles, moving fast from the south while a coordinated walker drive pushed noise from the north, a classic pincer that was elegant in its simplicity and effective in its execution. The governor had done his homework. He'd watched the prison's response patterns, identified the moments when Dante ranged furthest from the inner walls, and built an operation specifically around the window when the man in the red coat was outside the wire and most isolated. Dante and Daryl were 3 miles out on the extended perimeter sweep when the vehicles appeared. Daryl heard the engines first, his head came up, crossbow shifting, and then they were coming out of the tree line on 2 sides simultaneously, headlights cutting through the early morning gray, and Dante counted 8 armed men before the vehicles fully stopped. Professional spacing. Overlapping fields of fire. Someone had taught these people or these people had taught themselves, which amounted to the same problem. Woodbury, Daryl said quietly. Yeah, Dante said. Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle. He had the look of a man executing orders he was professionally committed to regardless of his personal assessment of their wisdom. Governor wants to talk to you, he said, addressing Dante directly. You come with us. Dixon goes back to the prison. And if I don't feel like talking? Dante said. Martinez nodded at the tree lean. 6 more men stepped out of the shadows with rifles already shouldered. 14 total. All of them aimed at Daryl. Not at Dante. At Daryl. Dante looked at the rifles pointed at Daryl. Looked at Daryl, who had his crossbow up and his jaw set and the specific expression of a man who would absolutely go down fighting if Dante let him. Looked back at Martinez. Smart, Dante said. It came out genuinely appreciative, which seemed to unsettle Martinez more than anger would have. Tell your guys to lower their weapons and I'll come voluntarily. Point them at him for another 5 seconds and we find out what happens when I stop being cooperative. The temperature of the standoff changed. Martinez looked at the calm certainty in Dante's face and made the calculation that competent soldiers made when they recognized they were looking at something outside their operational parameters. He signaled. The rifles came down. Dante looked at Daryl. Go back. Tell Rick I went voluntarily. Tell him not to do anything stupid for at least 24 hours. That's a terrible plan, Daryl said. It's not a plan yet, Dante said. It's a starting position. He handed Daryl Rebellion, the sword, not the pistols, a calculated choice that Daryl received with visible confusion. Keep that safe. I'll want it back. Then he walked to Martinez's vehicle and got in. Woodbury was exactly what Michonne had described. Functional, organized, and rotten at its foundations in the specific way that settlements built on fear rather than trust were always rotten. Dante could feel it in the way people moved through the streets. Purposeful but careful. The particular economy of motion that came from years of monitoring which behaviors attracted attention. The governor met him in what had been a city manager's office, cleared of its original furniture, replaced with something that aspired toward authority. Maps on the walls. A desk that was positioned to put visitors slightly lower than the man behind it. Philip Blake understood staging. He also, Dante noted, had 4 armed guards positioned at the corners of the room. I appreciate you coming, the governor said, with the warmth of a man who knew exactly how voluntary the arrangement had been. I was in the neighborhood, Dante said, dropping into the visitor's chair with the comfortable ease of a man who had not just been escorted at gunpoint. He looked around the room with unhurried interest. Nice setup. The desk positioning is a classic move. Little obvious, but it works on most people. The governor's smile didn't change. You're not most people. No, Dante agreed. What are you? Professionally. Demon hunter. Technically. Half demon. Practically. He spread his hands. Someone who doesn't particularly enjoy being collected. The governor leaned forward. I'm not collecting you. I'm offering you something. You're offering me something you think I want in exchange for something you want, Dante said. Which is fine, that's how negotiation works. But let's skip the part where you pretend it's something else. What do you actually want? Something shifted behind the governor's eye. The performance dialed back a fraction, not enough to be vulnerability, but enough to be a different kind of performance. The one that was closer to honest. "I want what you have," the governor said. "Not the power itself. The security of it. Woodbury has 70 people who go to sleep every night knowing that the walls might not hold. That a herd like the one you cleared could end everything they've built in an afternoon." He held Dante's gaze. "You could change that. Not as a prisoner. As a partner." Dante was quiet for a moment. In the silence, the arena sounds drifted in from outside, crowd noise, the particular ugly energy of people watching violence for entertainment rather than necessity. He'd heard it since they'd arrived. He'd been waiting for the governor to address it. "What's in the arena?" Dante said. The governor's expression didn't flicker. "Entertainment. Morale management. People need release in difficult times." "People need release," Dante repeated. "So you put them in a pit and make them fight. Volunteers." "Sure," Dante said, in a tone that made clear exactly how much he believed that. The governor studied him. "Does it matter? In a world like this?" "It's the only thing that matters in a world like this," Dante said. His voice had lost its lightness. Not angry, just direct, the way he got when performance stopped being useful. "The whole world already went to hell. What you build in the wreckage tells you what you actually are when the rules stop applying." He stood up. "Your walls are strong, Governor. Your people are scared. Those two things aren't unrelated." He walked to the door. The 4 guards shifted. "You're not leaving," the governor said quietly. "Not tonight," Dante agreed, turning back. "But I'm not staying in a cell either. Give me a room with a window and we can keep talking tomorrow. Put me in a cell and this conversation is over before it starts." He held the governor's gaze. "I came voluntarily. I'll leave the same way, eventually. How this goes between now and then is entirely up to you." The governor looked at him for a long moment. Then he told a guard to find their guest a room. The room they gave him had a window, as requested, and a lock on the outside that was more symbolic than functional given what Dante was capable of, and a view of the arena that he suspected was either a test or a message or both. He watched the Saturday night fights from that window. It was worse than he'd expected, which was saying something because he'd calibrated his expectations low. The arena was a cleared lot ringed with salvaged fencing and lit by generator-powered floodlights that gave everything the flat, overexposed quality of a nightmare. The crowd was Woodbury's entire population, present in the way that populations were present when attendance wasn't technically mandatory but the consequences of absence were socially significant. They cheered with the desperate energy of people who had been given permission to feel something uncomplicated. 2 men fought in the ring with walkers chained at the perimeter, the dead used as obstacles and hazards, a detail that told Dante more about Philip Blake's psychology than anything the man had said in their meeting. The walkers weren't the point. The walkers were the set dressing. The point was the spectacle of humans hurting each other while other humans watched and approved. Dante had seen this before. Not in the apocalypse, but in the demonic hierarchies he'd spent his career dismantling. The strong preying on the less strong, the architecture of cruelty dressed up as entertainment or tradition or necessity. It was the same machinery regardless of the world it ran in. He turned from the window and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Rick's prison. The contrast was not subtle. 2 settlements, roughly comparable in age and circumstance, built from the same raw material of survivors and scarcity and the daily pressure of a world trying to kill them. One had gardens and children's laughter and a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks because he was carrying everyone's survival like a physical weight. The other had an arena and a governor with one eye and the particular confident cruelty of someone who had decided that civilization was whatever he said it was. He thought about what he'd said to the governor. What you build in the wreckage tells you what you actually are. He meant it. He'd meant it more than most things he said, which wasn't a high bar given his general approach to conversation, but still. In the morning, the governor came to him rather than summoning him, which was a tactical concession that Dante noted without commenting on. He brought coffee, real coffee, which in this world was a statement of resources and therefore of power, and sat across from Dante with the easy manner of a man who had decided overnight to try a different approach. "The arena bothers you," the governor said. "The arena is a symptom," Dante said. "The thing it's a symptom of is what bothers me." "And what's that?" "You've decided your people's survival depends on them being afraid of you," Dante said. "Which works, short term. Terrified people follow orders. But terrified people also make bad decisions under pressure, and they don't tell you when things are going wrong because they're afraid of what you'll do with the information." He drank the coffee. It was genuinely excellent. "You're building a machine that runs on fear, and fear is a finite fuel source." The governor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful quality of someone deciding how honest to be. "You think Grimes is doing it better?" "I think Grimes is doing it differently," Dante said. "Whether better shakes out depends on factors neither of us controls." "Come work with me," the governor said. "Not for me. With me. I'm not too proud to learn from someone who's seen more than I have." He leaned forward. "I built this place from nothing. 70 people who'd be dead without what I created here. That counts for something." Dante looked at him, really looked, the way he looked at things. When he was trying to determine if there was something salvageable inside them. He'd done this with demons occasionally, in the early years before he'd learned that the answer was almost always no. He did it with the governor now and arrived at a similar conclusion, not because Philip Blake was a demon but because the thing driving him wore the same shape as the thing that drove the worst demons he'd encountered. Not malice, exactly. Something colder. The absolute conviction that his judgment about what other people needed superseded their own. "You counted for something," Dante said. "But you've decided that because you built it, you own it. Including the people in it." He stood up. "That's where you lost me." The governor's expression finally dropped its warmth. What was underneath was not angry. Anger would have been easier to work with. It was the flat, assessing calm of a man moving from one approach to the next with the pragmatic efficiency of someone for whom other people were always ultimately instrumental. "Then I suppose," the governor said, "we find out what you're actually worth." The arena that night had a new feature. Dante stood in the center of the lit lot with the crowd ringing the fencing and the governor in his elevated chair and 30 walkers unchained and released simultaneously from the holding pens. No human opponent. Just the dead, in numbers, under lights, with 70 people watching to see what the man in the red coat was made of. Dante looked at the walkers converging from all sides. Looked up at the governor. Then he looked at the crowd, the scared, conditioned, desperate faces of 70 people who had traded their autonomy for the illusion of safety, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the walkers. He put them down fast. Faster than was necessary. Faster than was safe for his energy reserves. He moved through them with devil trigger burning at half capacity, bright enough to be visible from the fencing, spectacular. Enough to be undeniable, but he did it while watching the crowd, not the governor, and what he saw in their faces as the display unfolded was not the savage entertainment the arena usually produced. It was something closer to hope. That was the crack in the governor's foundation. Not the walls, not the weapons, not the political architecture of fear he'd spent months constructing. The crack was 70 people watching something that made them feel like the world could be survived without being afraid of the man standing behind them. The governor saw it too. Dante could tell from the way his expression changed, the flat calm replaced briefly, involuntarily, by something sharp and cold and specific. Not anger. Recognition. He was out of Woodbury before dawn. Not through the gate, through the eastern wall, where a section of fencing had a stress fracture at its base that Dante had identified on his first perimeter walk through the settlement. He'd filed it away with the automatic habit of someone who always located the exits before anything else. He pulled the section back quietly, slipped through, and was 2 miles into the Georgia darkness before the first watch rotation would have noticed his absence. He moved fast. Not devil trigger fast, he was conserving, banking energy for whatever came next, but fast enough to cover ground in the pre-dawn gray with the efficiency of someone who had navigated worse terrain in worse conditions with worse things behind him. The problem was waiting for him at the prison. He heard the vehicles a half-mile out, multiple engines, the specific acoustic signature of a coordinated approach rather than a single runner. He pushed his pace and came over the rise south of the prison to find 4 of the governor's trucks parked in a loose arc outside the outer fence, their headlights cutting across the chain link, and the governor himself standing outside his vehicle with a megaphone and the patient expression of a man who had anticipated exactly this sequence of events and planned accordingly. The governor had brought 30 men, and the angles of the vehicles gave his shooters overlapping coverage of the main gate and both visible watchtowers. Dante stopped at the tree line and assessed. The governor raised the megaphone. "I know you're out there," he called, his amplified voice carrying easily across the open ground. He wasn't talking to the prison. He was talking to the darkness at the tree line. "I told you we'd find out what you were worth. Turns out the answer is quite a lot to the people behind that fence." Dante stepped out of the tree line. The governors. Of someone memorizing a face for future reference. He looked at the governor. "Let them go," Dante said. "Then we talk." "We're past talking," the governor said pleasantly. "We're at the part where you make a choice." "You're going to regret this," Dante said. Not a threat, a statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of a man reading the future from the present the way a navigator reads currents. "Probably," the governor agreed. "But not today." Dante was quiet for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds he ran every tactical calculation available, the angles, the numbers, the variables, the acceptable losses. He was fast enough to reach the governor before anyone could stop him. He was durable enough to absorb significant incoming fire. He could detonate a full devil trigger and scatter 30 armed men like leaves. And in the chaos, Glenn and Maggie would be in the middle of it. He'd spent his career making choices that prioritized the mission over collateral considerations because the mission was usually the prevention of something catastrophic and the collateral considerations were usually theoretical. This was not theoretical. Glenn's cut was fresh. Maggie's breathing was controlled but shallow. He holstered ebony and ivory. The governor blinked. It was the first genuinely unguarded expression Dante had seen from him. "Smart," the governor said. "Temporary," Dante said. They zip-tied his wrists with the industrial cable ties that Martinez had clearly brought specifically for this purpose, which told Dante the governor had planned for this outcome specifically, which meant the Glenn and Maggie extraction had been the plan all along, not a contingency but the primary operation. He'd taken them from a supply run, used them as the lever, and the whole Woodbury conversation had been the setup for this moment. Dante sat in the back of the governor's vehicle between 2 armed guards and looked out the window at the prison receding behind them. Rick was at. 30 men tracked him immediately, weapons up, flashlights converging, and Dante walked toward the prison with his hands visible and his pace unhurried, closing the distance between himself and the standoff with the calm of someone who understood that running would accomplish nothing useful. "Here's the situation," the governor said, lowering the megaphone to speak directly as Dante approached. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, in the way that made it worse. "You come back to Woodbury with me, voluntarily, and these people go about their mourning. You don't," he gestured at one of his vehicles. The rear doors opened. Martinez stepped out, and behind him came Glenn and Maggie, zip-tied, moving with the careful stiffness of people trying not to give their captors a reason to escalate. Dante stopped walking. The geometry of the situation locked into place with the particular cold clarity that replaced emotion in moments when emotion was a liability. Glenn had a cut above his eye, recent, still seeping. Maggie's jaw was set in a specific way of someone controlling fear through sheer will. They were alive and functional and scared, which meant the governor was using them as leverage rather than making an example of them, which meant he still wanted something badly enough to keep his options open. He wanted Dante cooperative. He wanted Dante contained. He wanted the thing Dante represented. That flicker of hope he'd seen in the arena crowd, controlled and pointed in his direction rather than someone else's. Rick's voice came from the catwalk, tight with controlled fury. Dante. I see it, Dante said. He looked at Glenn and Maggie. Glenn met his eyes with the steady directness of someone communicating through eye contact because his hands weren't available. Don't do it, don't trade yourself, we'll find another way. Maggie was looking at the governor with an expression that Dante recognized because he'd worn it himself, the specific focused hatred. The gate, he could see the silhouette, rigid with the specific tension of a man swallowing a decision he hated because the alternative was worse. Daryl was next to Rick. And Daryl had rebellion. Dante looked at the sword across Daryl's back as the vehicle pulled away and felt something that wasn't quite comfort but was adjacent to it. He'd handed it over deliberately. Not because he needed Daryl to have it, but because rebellion coming back to him meant Daryl coming for him, and Daryl Dixon coming for someone with a clear purpose and a good tracking instinct was not an asset the governor had factored into his planning. The vehicle moved through the Georgia dawn toward Woodbury. In the back seat, zip-tied between two men with rifles, Dante closed his eyes and started counting. He gave it 6 hours. He was wrong about the 6 hours. It took 4. The first sign was the crossbow bolt that came through the eastern watchtower window at Woodbury and took the guard's radio out of his hand without touching his fingers, a shot that required a specific combination of distance, angle, and the particular arrogance of a marksman who knew exactly how good he was. Daryl Dixon, announcing his presence in the most efficient way available to him. The second sign was the sound. Not the roar of an engine or the crack of gunfire but something quieter and more specific. The stress fracture in the eastern wall giving way entirely, the fencing peeling back, and Rick Grimes coming through it low and fast with Michonne beside him and 4 others behind them in a wedge formation that moved with the coordinated purpose of people who had done their reconnaissance and committed to the outcome. Dante heard it from the room they'd put him in. Different room this time, no window, a heavier lock, and started on the zip ties. The cable ties were rated for human strength. Dante's wrists were not operating at human strength parameters. He pulled steadily, feeling the plastic bite and then give, the ties snapping with a sharp crack that the guard outside his door heard half a second before Dante opened that door from the inside and the guard discovered that the lock had been largely theoretical all along. He stepped over the guard. Unconscious, not dead, a distinction Dante maintained when the circumstances allowed it, and took the man's sidearm and radio and moved into the corridor. Woodbury was in controlled chaos, which was different from uncontrolled chaos in that people were moving with purpose rather than panic, but the purpose was fragmenting because the threat was coming from multiple directions simultaneously and the governor's command structure required Philip Blake at its center to function, and Philip Blake was currently moving toward the armory with Martinez and 4 guards. Plaster. He stayed on his feet. The governor's expression moved through surprise and into something that was recalculating rapidly. Dante looked at the entry wound. Looked at the governor. I did tell you, Dante said, that you'd regret this. He pushed off the wall. The governor fired twice more. Center mass, shots that hit and registered and did not stop the man in the red coat from closing the distance between them with the steady, inevitable momentum of something that had decided to end a thing and was in the process of ending it. Dante took the rifle by the barrel. Bent it. Set it aside. The guards from the armory interior came through the door and met Rebellion, back in Dante's hand now, retrieved from Daryl in the chaos of the eastern breach. And the corridor became briefly very loud and then very quiet. The governor stood alone. He was breathing hard. For the first time since Dante had met him, Philip Blake looked like a man who had run out of moves and knew it. The performance was gone, the warmth, the calculation, the architectural confidence of someone who always had a next step prepared. What was underneath was smaller and more human and in some ways more dangerous because of it, the way cornered things were dangerous. "You're going to kill me," the governor said. It wasn't quite a question. Dante looked at him. His shoulder was already closing, the Sparta regeneration working through the damage with the slow, reliable efficiency it always managed given enough time. He could feel Glenn and Maggie behind him in the corridor, Rick's group filtering in from the eastern approach, Woodbury's people emerging from buildings and doorways with the cautious, bewildered energy of a population whose structure had just collapsed around them. He thought about what he'd said at the prison. What you build in the wreckage tells you what you actually are. He looked at the governor and thought about what it would tell him. "No," Dante said. He hit him once. Rather than toward his people. Dante watched that from a corner and filed it. He found Glenn and Maggie in a storage room off the main building, still zip-tied, both alert, Glenn's cut dry to a dark line above his eye. Maggie had worked one hand partially free and was 3 minutes from solving the problem herself, which Dante noted with genuine appreciation. "Took you long enough," Glenn said. "Had a nap," Dante said, cutting the ties with a knife he'd taken from the unconscious guard. "Can you both move?" "Yes," Maggie said, already moving. The fight through Woodbury's center was fast and loud and settled several questions that had been building since Dante's arrival in this world. Rick's group moved with a tactical intelligence that consistently exceeded what their numbers should have produced. Michonne in particular operated with a sword and a fury that cleared paths faster than gunfire would have, the katana describing arcs that Dante respected with the professional admiration of one blade practitioner watching another work. Dante moved ahead of them. Not because Rick's people needed covering, they didn't, or not primarily. But because the governor was at the armory and the armory contained things that would make the extraction geometrically more complicated if Philip Blake reached them first. He got there 30 seconds behind the governor. The armory door was open. Martinez was inside, handing out weapons with the practiced efficiency of a quartermaster who had run this drill before. The governor was at the door with a rifle already up, and he saw Dante coming down the corridor and swung the barrel toward him with the smooth motion of a man who had decided the leverage play was over and the elimination play had begun. Dante pulled Ebony. The governor fired first. The round caught Dante in the left shoulder, a hit that would have ended most confrontations immediately, and which knocked him sideways into the corridor wall with enough force to crack a single, precise, open-handed strike that put Philip Blake unconscious against the armory wall with the careful economy of someone who had decided where the line was and stayed on his side of it. He turned to Rick. Rick looked at the unconscious governor. At the bent rifle. At the closing wound in Dante's shoulder. At the man in the red coat standing in the wreckage of Woodbury's power structure with the mildly tired expression of someone who had handled a moderately demanding Tuesday. "It's done," Dante said. Rick looked at his people, Glenn, Maggie, Michonne, Daryl still coming in from the east with the crossbow slung and rebellion extended toward Dante hilt first. He looked at Woodbury's survivors emerging into the morning light with the blinking uncertainty of people rediscovering what it felt like to breathe without permission. "What do we do with them?" Rick asked. The question encompassed the settlement, the survivors, the unconscious governor, the entire complicated wreckage of what had just happened. Dante took rebellion from Daryl. Settled it across his back. Looked at the 70 people who no longer had a structure to live inside. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question." Conclusion. Woodbury didn't fall. That was the part nobody had expected. Rick's group absorbed its survivors with the careful, pragmatic generosity of people who understood that numbers mattered and that the humans standing blinking in the morning light were not responsible for the choices of the man who had organized their fear into a system. It was complicated and slow and occasionally contentious, and it was exactly the kind of work that couldn't be solved with a sword or a gun or a devil trigger detonation. Dante stayed through the transition. Not because he was asked to. Rick asked him nothing, understanding instinctively that asking was the wrong approach. But because the dimensional rift that had deposited him here showed no signs of reopening, and because there was work to do, and because the man in the red coat had discovered, somewhere between a highway outside Atlanta and an armory in Woodbury, that he was considerably less comfortable with uninvolvement than his professional history suggested. He ran perimeter sweeps with Daryl. He helped Glenn reinforce the outer fencing. He ate Carol's cooking and lost badly at cards to Herschel and let Carl ask him questions about demons for an hour one afternoon because the kid had earned it. The governor, when he woke, was a problem for later. Problems for later were, in this world, just called tomorrow. The rift would open again. Dante knew it the way he knew most things, instinctively, without evidence, with the deep certainty of someone calibrated to the rhythms of the impossible. When it did, he would go back to his world and his work and his half-demolished office and the demons that were certainly piling up in his absence. But the prison would still be standing. He'd made sure of that much. Live long and prosper. More stories await.